in cyber attacks, even against this Parliament itself. Does the Foreign Secretary really believe this is a country that wants to engage with the international community?
Honourable friend makes the point very powerfully. Iran is giving the international community, certainly the United Kingdom, and in relation to the Grace 1 episode, the very clear message that it doesn't live up to its word. If Iran wants a path to international respectability and the prosperity that comes with it, it's going to have to reverse those actions, live up to its responsibility, and then there is a possibility for it.
Thank you. Order. Statement. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. They want a change, Mr. Speaker. They want a change of government, Mr. Speaker. Let them have an election. Now, with your permission, I shall make a statement on yesterday's Supreme Court.
There'll be ample opportunity for everybody who wants to question the Prime Minister in conformity with usual practice to do so, but the statement must and will be heard. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I shall make a statement on yesterday's Supreme Court verdict and the way forward for this paralysed Parliament. 3 years ago, more people voted to leave the European Union than have ever voted for any party or proposition in our history. Politicians of all parties promised the public that they would honour the result. Sadly, many have since done all they could to abandon those promises and to overturn that democratic vote. And after 3 years of dither and delay that left this country at risk of being locked forever in the orbit of the EU, this government that I lead has been trying truly to get us out. And most people, indeed most supporters of the party opposite, regardless of how they voted 3 years ago, think the referendum must be respected. They want Brexit done. I want Brexit done, and people want us out on October the 31st. With a new deal if possible, but without one if necessary. Now, 64 days ago, I was told that Brussels would never reopen the withdrawal agreement. We are now discussing a reopened withdrawal agreement in the negotiations. I was told that Brussels would never consider alternatives to the backstop, the trap that keeps the UK effectively in the EU but with no say. We're now discussing those alternatives in the negotiations. I was told Brussels would never consider arrangements that were not permanent. We're now discussing in the negotiations an arrangement that works on the principle of consent and is not permanent. I was told there was no chance of a new deal, but we are discussing a new deal. And this is in spite of the best efforts of the party opposite and this Parliament to wreck our negotiations by their attempts to take no deal off the table. The truth is that the majority in this Parliament, the majority opposite, are not opposed to the so-called no deal. This Parliament does not want Brexit to happen at all. And many of those who voted for the Surrender Act a few weeks ago said then that their intention was to stop a no-deal Brexit. They have said every day since that Parliament must vote against any deal at all. I think the people of this country can see very clearly what is going on. The people at home know that this...
Order! Order! People are gesticulating wildly. I can scarcely hear the Prime Minister myself, and I wish to hear the statement, as other colleagues should also do. The Prime Minister...
The people of this country can see perfectly clearly what is going on. They know that Parliament does not want to honour its promises to respect the referendum. The people at home know that this Parliament will keep delaying, it will keep sabotaging the negotiations because they don't want a deal. Mr. Speaker, the truth is that members opposite are living in a fantasy world. They really imagine that that somehow they are going to cancel. This is what they want to do. They're going to cancel the first referendum. They're going to legislate for a second referendum. And Parliament will promise that this time, perhaps not the lady opposite, but Parliament will promise that this time it really, really will respect that vote. And they think that the public will therefore vote to remain, and everybody will forget the last few years. Mr. Speaker, I have to say I think that is an extraordinary delusion and a fantasy even greater than the communist fantasies peddled by the Leader of the Opposition. It will not happen. The public don't want another referendum. What they want and what they demand is that we honour the promise we made to the voters to respect the first referendum. And they also want us to move on, to put Brexit behind us and focus on the NHS, on violent crime, and on cutting the cost of living. And that is why I brought forward a Queen's speech. This government intends to present a programme for life after Brexit. But some members of this House could not stand that either. Instead of facing the voters, the opposition turned tail and fled from an election. Instead of deciding to let the voters decide, they ran to the courts instead. And despite the fact that I followed the exact same process as my predecessors in calling a Queen's speech, the Supreme Court was asked to intervene in this process for the first time ever, and it is absolutely no disrespect to the judiciary to say I think the court was wrong to pronounce on what is essentially a political question at a time.
Order! Whatever the strength and intensity of feeling and the passions to which these matters give rise, we must hear what is being said in the chamber, and I wish to hear the Prime Minister.
The court was wrong to pronounce on what is essentially a political question at a time of great national controversy. So we have opposition MPs that block and delay everything, running to the courts to block and delay even more, including blocking legislation to improve and invest in our NHS and keeping violent criminals in jail. And I think the people outside this House understand what is happening. They know that nothing can disguise the truth. It's not just that this Parliament is gridlocked, paralysed, and refusing to deliver on the priorities of the people. It's not just unable to move forward. It's worse than that, Mr. Speaker. Out of sheer selfishness and political cowardice, members opposite are unwilling to move aside and give the people a say. They see MPs demanding that the people should be given a say one week and then running away from the election that would provide the people with a say. And worst of all, they see ever more elaborate legal and political manoeuvres from the party opposite, which is absolutely determined to say, we know best, and thumb their noses at the 17.4 million people who voted to leave the European Union. The Leader of the Opposition and his party do not trust the people. The Leader of the Opposition and his party are determined to throw out the referendum result, whatever the cost. They don't care, Mr. Speaker, about the bill for hundreds of millions of pounds that will come with every week of delay. They don't care if another year or more is wasted in arguing about a referendum that happened 3 years ago. All that matters to them now is an obsessive desire to overrule the referendum result. While we want to take our country up a gear, to go forward with a fantastic programme, an accelerated programme of investment in infrastructure, in health and education and technology, they are throwing on the handbrake. Well, Mr. Speaker, we will not betray the people who sent us here. We will not. That's what they they want to do. We will not abandon the priorities that matter to the public. And we will continue to challenge those opposition parties to uphold democracy. If honourable and right honourable members opposite so disagreed with this government's commitment to leaving on October the 31st, they had a very simple remedy at their disposal, did they not? They could have voted for a general election. I have to confess, Mr. Speaker, that I was a little shocked to discover that the party whose members stood up in Brighton this week and repeatedly and in the most strident terms demanded an election, I heard them, is the very same party whose members already twice this month, not once but twice, refused to allow the people to decide on their next government. For 2 years they have demanded an election, but twice they have voted against it. The Leader of the Opposition changes his mind so often. I wonder whether he supports an election today or whether the Shadow Chancellor or the Shadow Attorney General have overruled him again, because they know that the voters will judge their manifesto for what it is: more pointless delay. Is he going to demand, perhaps he's going to demand an election and then vote against it? Just as he says he wants to negotiate a new Brexit deal and then vote against that too. Is he actually going to vote no confidence in this government? Is he going to dodge a vote of no confidence in me as Prime Minister in order to escape the verdict of the voters? I wonder, does he in his heart even want to be Prime Minister anymore? He says that I should go to Brussels on 17th of October and negotiate another pointless delay, but he doesn't want to go himself. And even if he did, his colleagues wouldn't let him, because quite frankly they recoil. They recoil at the idea of him negotiating on the people's behalf, representing this country with the likes of Vladimir Putin, let alone the EU or the mullahs of Tehran. Or is it perhaps that he wants a Conservative government? It would be a curious state of affairs indeed if Her Majesty's loyal opposition had every faith in the government of the day. So if in fact the party opposite does not have confidence in the government, they will have a chance to prove it. They have until the House rises. Let them listen. I think they should listen to this, Mr. Speaker. They have until the House rises today to table a motion of no confidence in the government. Come on then. And we can have that vote tomorrow. Or if any of the other parties, the smaller parties, fancy a go, they can table that motion and we'll give you the time for a vote. Will they have the courage to act, or will they refuse to take responsibility and do nothing but dither and delay? Why wouldn't they? What are they scared of, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, it is now well over. If that's what you're scared of, then have an election.
Order. I appeal to the House to have some regard to how our proceedings are viewed by people watching them in the country at large. Order! Let the remainder of the statement be heard. I'm grateful for the Prime Minister's exhortation, but I don't require it. I'm perfectly content. What I want to hear is the rest of the statement and then questioning on it. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you. And as I commend this statement to the House, I say it is time to get Brexit done. Get Brexit done so we respect the referendum. Get Brexit done so we can move on to deal with the people's priorities, the NHS, the cost of living. Let's get Brexit done so we can start to reunite this country after the divisions of the referendum, rather than having another one. It's time for this Parliament, finally, to take responsibility for its decisions. We decided to call that referendum. We promised time and again to respect it. I think the people of this country have had enough of it. This Parliament must either stand aside and let this government get Brexit done, or bring a vote of confidence and finally face the day of reckoning with the voters. And I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Prime Minister for an advance copy of his statement. Unfortunately, it was like his illegal shutting down of Parliament. Null, of no effect, and should be quashed. In the words of the Supreme Court. This, Mr. Speaker, was 10 minutes of bluster from a dangerous Prime Minister who thinks he is above the law. But in truth, Mr. Speaker, is not fit for the office which he holds. Mr. Speaker, I'm glad to see so many colleagues back here doing what they were elected to do, holding the government to account for its failings. Whether it's the attempts to shut down democracy, its sham Brexit negotiations, its chaotic and inadequate no-deal preparations, its allegations of corruption, its failure on climate change, its failure to step in to save Thomas Cook, This government, Mr. Speaker, is failing the people of Britain, and the people of Britain know it.
Order! I said that the Prime Minister shouldn't be shouted down. The same goes for the Leader of the Opposition. And let me say to people bellowing from a sedentary position, stop it. You will exhaust your vocal cords. You will get nowhere. It won't work. And these proceedings will continue for as long as is necessary for the Chair to be satisfied that proper scrutiny has taken place. It is as simple and incontrovertible as that. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday's Supreme Court verdict represents an extraordinary and, I believe, precarious moment in this country's history. The highest court in this land has found the Prime Minister broke the law when he tried to to shut down our democratic accountability at a crucial moment in our public life. The judges concluded there was no reason, and I quote, let alone a good reason, for the Prime Minister to have shut down Parliament. After yesterday's ruling, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should have done the honourable thing and resigned. Mr. Speaker, here he is, forced back to this House to rightfully face the scrutiny he tried to avoid. With no shred of remorse or humility, and, of course, no substance whatsoever. That's right. So let's see if he will answer some questions.
He won't. He won't.
Does the Prime Minister agree with his Attorney General
write it down, Boris,
that the government got it wrong, or with the Leader of the House that the Supreme Court committed a constitutional coup? This, Mr. Speaker, is a vital question about whether the government respects the judiciary or not. The Attorney General was also categorical that the government would comply with the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act. Can the Prime Minister confirm that? Yeah. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to those MPs from all parties across the House, the Lords and in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Assembly, who have not only fought so hard to stop a disastrous no deal, but continued to take the case against prorogation through the courts. The government has failed to silence our democracy. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, during the period of unlawful prorogation, the government was forced to release their Yellowhammer no-deal analysis and plans. No wonder the Prime Minister has been so eager to avoid scrutiny and so eager to hide the dangers of his Brexit plan. The release of those documents leads to many questions the government must now answer that our Parliament is back in operation. So I would like to start by asking the Prime Minister why Mr. Speaker, by asking the Prime Minister why the government described leaked Yellowhammer documents in August as being out of date. When the documents were later produced in September, they were word for word the same documents. It is clear they have tried to hide from the people the truth, the real truth of a no-deal Brexit, and tried to hide the fact that their policy would heap misery on the people of this country. Let's just take a look at the analysis. Chaos at Britain's ports with months of disruption. People going short of fuel and fresh foods.
Your paper?
It's your paper, you wrote it, you tried to hide it. I beg your pardon, Mr. Speaker, I don't hold you responsible for writing the document. Disruption of people's vital medical supplies. Rises in energy prices for every household in the whole country. A hard border for the people of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Most damning of all, Mr. Speaker, is the passage that simply says, and I quote, "Low-income groups will be disproportionately affected." Well, there we have it, Mr. Speaker. A simple warning, a simple truth, that a Tory government is continuing to follow a policy they will know will hit the poorest people in our country the hardest. They simply do not care. Mr. Speaker, the damning document we have already seen is only 6 pages long. It's only right that this House should expect more transparency from this government. The government says they're doing all they can to get a deal before October the 31st. But the truth, Mr. Speaker, is the Prime Minister has hardly put any effort into negotiations, any progress at all, looks at its most generous best to be minimal. Only yesterday, the European Union's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, said that there was no reason today for optimism. Can I ask the Prime Minister why he believes Mr. Barnier has that view? This House is still yet to hear any detail of any deal the government seeks to negotiate. We are told the government has distributed papers to Brussels outlining proposals for a change to the backstop. Will the Prime Minister publish these papers and allow them to be debated in this House of Parliament? For this government to have any credibility with our people, they need to show they have an actual plan. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister also has questions to answer about his conduct in public office. And in particular, allegations that he failed to declare an interest in the allocation of public money to a close friend whilst he was Mayor of London. It was announced today that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport is reviewing the funds allocated in the light of the Sunday Times report. Did the Prime Minister initiate that review? Will the Prime Minister fully cooperate with the DCMS review and that of the Greater London Assembly? Will he refer himself to the Cabinet Secretary for investigation? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister, no Prime Minister, is not above the law. Mr. Speaker, no one can trust this Prime Minister, not on Iran, not on Thomas Cook, not on climate change, not on Brexit.
Iran, yes, on Iran.
For the good of this country, Mr. Speaker,
Order. The Leader of the Opposition is entitled to be heard in this Parliament. Order. And he will be heard. I don't mind how long it takes. These exchanges will take place in an orderly manner. Be in no doubt about that. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quite simply, for the good of this country, he should go. Mr. Speaker, he says he wants a general election. I want a general election. It's very simple. If you want an election, if he wants an election, get an extension and let's have an election.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman asked several questions. I'll try and deal with them in order. On the first point, my friend the Attorney General made absolutely clear, of course, that this is a judgment with which he disagreed. Though, of course, we respect the judgment of the Supreme Court. On the second point, about the Ben Burt Act? I will say what I'm sure he understands. We will, of course, obey the law, and we will come out of the EU on October the 31st. On his point about preparations for a no-deal Brexit, I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, who just spoke for 2 hours on this matter. Our preparations are very far advanced, and I think this country can be entirely confident that we will be ready, deal or no deal. On his point about whether we are on the verge of getting a deal or not, well, it is absolutely true that negotiations are difficult, but we are making progress. And all I will say to him and to his friends is that they have not been made easier by the Surrender Act that he passed. And I am very proud, by the way, to take his next point, about everything that I did as Mayor of London. I may say to the current Mayor that he'd be better off spending less on press officers and more on police officers in London, because we were funding getting 20,000 more on our streets. And as for being trusted on Iran, Mr. Speaker, this is a man who took the shilling of the mullahs from Press TV. Mr. Speaker, I think there's something. I was rather sad, actually, in a way, that the Labour conference was interrupted by the ruling, because I was awestruck by some of the things I heard, doubtless designed to obscure the inanity of his policy over Brexit. He wants to abolish fee-paying schools at a cost of £7 billion to the taxpayer. He wants a 4-day working week, cutting the incomes of the lowest paid in this country. He wants to abolish Ofsted, and now we hear he wants to abolish all immigration controls from the EU. But there was a crucial passage missing from his speech, it turns out, Mr. Speaker. I think there's something slightly pitiful, in a way, about the right honourable gentleman. It seems that he actually did want to call an election now, Mr. Speaker. There was a passage in his speech calling for an election now, but it was censored by the Stasi in the form of the shadow chancellor. Or possibly it was the shadow Lord Chancellor. Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman is being gagged. He's being muzzled. He's being held captive by his colleagues. They won't let him say what he wants to say. I say, free the Islington One, Mr. Speaker. And why won't they allow him to have an election, Mr. Speaker? Why won't they allow him to unleash his charms on the electorate? It's because they're not only terrified that he's going to lose, but also even more terrified by the remote possibility that he might win. He can't control his own party. He can't decide whether he's for Leave or for Remain. He's being held captive by his colleagues. The electorate are being held captive by this zombie parliament and this zombie opposition, and he wants the entire country to be held captive in the EU after October the 31st at a cost of more than £1 billion a month. We say no. I say no. Let's get Brexit done and let's take this country forward.
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister? Order! 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 I appeal to members of the House to calm themselves. I've just called the right honourable gentleman, the member for Chingford and Woodford Green. He is entitled to put his question, and the rest of us are entitled to hear him. Mr. Ian Duncan Smith. Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his very good put down of the shallow leader of the opposition. Can I also say that I understand now that his government has changed the root origin of the term yellowhammer to describe the botched attempt by the leader of the opposition to dispatch his own deputy. And could I ask him, I received and saw in my constituency, as others did recently, leaflets from the Labour Party calling for a general election now. Could he answer me this question? Can he give me any reason why we are not having an election at this particular point? Does he think for any moment it could be because the leader of the opposition fears his own party just as much as he fears us? Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his very acute question, Mr. Speaker, and I'm afraid the answer is very simple, that they don't want an election because they are not sure that the public would trust them with the government of this country, and I think that they're right, and I think that they put the yellow into Yellowhammer, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Prime Minister for advance copy of his statement? I have to say, when I read the first paragraph, and it talks about the Supreme Court verdict, Mr. Speaker, it wasn't the Supreme Court verdict, it was the judgment of the Supreme Court. Yeah. And perhaps the Prime Minister might start to show some respect for the judiciary. You know, we're here today because the Prime Minister was utterly humiliated by the Supreme Court by a count of 11-0. And you might have thought in that diatribe that we had that we might have had some humility, that we might have been able to acknowledge that what we've had is the unlawful shutting down of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, sorry is indeed the hardest word for the Prime Minister. You know, it was said by a former Prime Minister, where law ends, tyranny begins. And Mr. Speaker, while it pains me to say it, the fact the Prime Minister is still standing here today, he in fact does believe he is above the law. Well, Mr. Speaker, he is not. And thank heavens for the action that was brought in the courts in Scotland and England. And I want to pay tribute to my honourable friend for Edinburgh South West. And thank goodness the courts have done their job and made sure that parliamentarians are back where they should be, in this House, holding the government to court. The ruling of the Supreme Court has made it absolutely crystal clear. The actions of this government, this Prime Minister, led to the unlawful prorogation of Parliament. Yeah. Delivering the verdict, Lady Hale stated that prorogation was null and void. Have you no shame, Prime Minister? Mr. Speaker, the court concluded that the decision was unlawful because it had the effect of frustrating or preventing the ability of Parliament to carry out its constitutional functions without reasonable justification. Mr. Speaker, without reasonable justification. And the Prime Minister talks about us running off to the courts. Well, we got the courts to do what he failed to do, which was to respect parliamentary sovereignty. Frustrating, preventing Parliament carrying out its constitutional duties without reasonable justification. How devastating for a Prime Minister to have such a judgment. Where law ends, tyranny begins. Yet the Prime Minister said he didn't agree with the courts. He only agrees with his cronies in Number 10, his Brexit-obsessed fan club. He cannot pick and choose when it comes to the law. He must obey the law. That is not leadership. He quite simply is not fit for office. And Mr. Speaker, when I hear of the Prime Minister talking about a Surrender Act, how despicable that he refers to members of this House that are doing their duty to protect our constituents, and he uses language such as surrender. It is language which is not suitable from the Prime Minister of any country. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's position is no longer tenable. His failure to resign is an embarrassment. People have had enough of this shambles. Mr. Speaker, we have reached a difficult and dangerous point. Not just in...
The right honourable gentleman leads the third party in this House. He has a right to be heard. He will continue his contribution and he will be heard however long it takes. If the message has to be repeated again and again and again ad infinitum, so be it. He will be heard. End of subject. Ian Blackford.
I am much obliged, Mr. Speaker. We have reached a difficult and dangerous point, not just in relation to the Brexit crisis, but for the constitutional future of these islands and indeed the future of our democracy. We have a Prime Minister standing here in Parliament that he sought to silence. People across these countries will be reading today about how the Prime Minister fought the law, but the law won. Yeah. The Prime Minister, the head of government, who is responsible for the law, responsible for governance. What an example to the public. Let me be clear to the Prime Minister that he should resign. But if he fails to do so, yes, the opposition must unite to trigger a vote of no confidence to bring this chaotic government down. By triggering a vote of no confidence, we will ensure that the Benn Act is honoured to take no deal off the table by allowing the opposition to instil an interim leader to take back control and to protect our economy from the cliff edge. Mr Speaker, the Scottish National Party fully supports stopping no deal. It is our priority. But let me be clear to members on these benches, we are not powerless. Doing nothing is not an option. This is the time for leadership. Once we have removed the Prime Minister, removed the threat of no deal, the people must have their say through a general election as quickly as is possible. We must unstick this mess, and we must trust the people to make their choice. We cannot trust this Prime Minister. His time must be up. His days of lying, of cheating, and of undermining the rule of law must be numbered. So I only...
Order. Just for the avoidance of doubt, I'm sure the right honourable gentleman will not state in this House that the Prime Minister has lied in the House. He must not do so. Order. That is the order. That is the procedural position. He didn't say that, but he did refer to lying, and I know he cannot be referring to it in the context of the exchanges in this House. And a nod of the head to confirm that my interpretation is correct will suffice, and he can then proceed with the rest of his questioning. I'm correct in my surmise, I'm sure.
Indeed, Mr Speaker. So I have one question to the Prime Minister for now. Do the right thing and do it now. Prime Minister, end this dictatorship. Will you now resign?
The Prime Minister!
Mr Speaker, I thank the right honourable gentleman, and of course on his substantive point, we do respect the Supreme Court, Mr Speaker, and the reason that I want a Queen's speech and wanted a Queen's speech is quite frankly, of course, because we have to do what we can as a united kingdom to remedy the waste and incompetence of the high-taxing, fish-abandoning government of the SNP in Scotland. And that's why we are investing in 20,000 more police officers and 20 new hospital upgrades and levelling up education funding and funding gigabit broadband across the country. And I hope, Mr Speaker, and I bet the people of Scotland hope, that in spite of all the uselessness of the government of Scotland, that those benefits will be passed on to the people. Because that is the only obstacle in our way.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Supreme Court, Mr Speaker, mentioned that the prorogation had...
Order. I apologise for interrupting the honourable gentleman, but he too... Order. The honourable gentleman must be heard. I want to hear his question and the answer to it. Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Supreme Court mentioned that the prorogation had an extreme effect upon the fundamentals of our democracy. Does my right honourable friend accept that it is more than an extreme and undemocratic effect for Parliament itself to tear up its own Standing Order 14, because the priority that Standing Order gives to government business as compared to private members' business, such as the Surrender Act, derives exclusively from the fundamental democracy of the voters of this country in general elections, and to remedy this, they must be given an early general election to decide who governs this country.
Prime Minister.
my right honourable friend, and he is, of course, quite right in the sense that the people of this country can see all kinds of forces in this country going to quite extraordinary lengths, whether judicial or parliamentarian, to prevent Brexit from being delivered on October the 31st. But I have to tell my honourable friend, and I'm sure he will agree with me, we are not going to be deterred by such ruses, and we are going to get it done.
Jay Swinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is not serious. He needs to understand that actions have consequences. Even my 5-year-old knows that if you do something wrong, you have to say sorry. If my son can apologise for kicking a football indoors, surely the Prime Minister can have the humility to say sorry for misleading the Queen, misleading the country, and illegally shutting down our democracy.
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think quite frankly, one of the actions for which the Right Honourable Lady might wish to take responsibility was writing to the President of the European Commission, actively encouraging him not to do a deal with this country.
Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
As somebody who voted Remain in the referendum, I'm mindful of the fact that this House of Commons voted 6-1 in favour of having a referendum. On 2 occasions, the Prime Minister has attempted to call the general election, which would have taken place on the 15th of October. If the British people, where we get our mandate from, had decided there should have been another Prime Minister for that occasion, they would have had the opportunity. Why was that stopped?
Prime Minister.
My right honourable friend who speaks with great wisdom and with great experience of this place, but I cannot believe in all his time here he has ever seen a leader of the opposition actively forego and turn down, in full view of the British public, the opportunity to have a general election. But that is what has happened twice, and there can only be one possible explanation: that he doesn't think he can win.
Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There will be many people, not least the families of senior judges, who were murdered in Northern Ireland, many of them, including the Lord Justice of Appeal, who will wish that the Leader of the Opposition, when he supported a terrorist organisation that murdered judges, had really put those words into action much, much earlier in his career. When we talk about respect for the rule of law, it should have been respect for the rule of law through the decades of the Troubles in Northern Ireland as well. On Brexit, Mr. Speaker, the reality is that despite everything, the fundamentals remain unchanged, that we need to deliver on the Brexit referendum, but that we must do so ideally and, if possible, with a deal, and we want to get that deal through this House. So would he agree that the way to do that is to deal with the anti-democratic backstop, the trap that he talks about, the issue of consent? We will work with him on those issues. But that all the shenanigans in this House undermining the leverage of the Prime Minister is actually in danger of bringing about the very result that some who say they don't want a no deal will actually achieve.
Prime Minister.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for what he has just said, and of course I agree with him profoundly in his condemnation of terrorism. I make no comment on the support of the right honourable gentleman opposite for those organisations, because I've made that point many times before. But on his point about the negotiations, he is, I think, speaks with great maturity on this issue, because there is a chance to make progress. It will not be easy, but it clearly is not helped by the Surrender Act. But I think that neither he nor I, and that's what it is, because it would require us to take no deal off the table, neither he nor I are going to be daunted by that act. And I think that our confidence is growing, and we will work flat out to get a deal by October the 17th, and then, Mr. Speaker, this House will indeed have a chance to pronounce on it, as it was always intended that it should.
Mr. Jeremy Hunt.
Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on becoming Prime Minister, and I hope he's enjoying doing the job as much as I'm enjoying not doing the job. Does he agree that those who claim to defend parliamentary democracy are in fact putting it at grave risk by alienating a large proportion of the population who fear that this House is trying to block a democratic referendum result that we promised to honour?
Well said. It is a great pleasure to respond to my right honourable friend, because I'm reminded of the many times that he and I shared a platform, and frankly we spoke absolutely as one, Mr. Speaker, on that issue. He was right then and he is right now.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, can I say to the Prime Minister that those of us who voted for the European Union Withdrawal No. 2 Act make no apology whatsoever for having legislated to prevent the Prime Minister from taking this country out of the European Union on the 31st of October without an agreement. And the Prime Minister can shout as much as he likes from the dispatch box, but he cannot hide the fact he has no mandate, no majority and no credibility. Now, Mr. Speaker, on the 3rd of September, the Prime Minister told the House that he would bring forward proposals for an alternative to the backstop well before the end of the 30-day deadline set by Chancellor Merkel. That deadline has now passed. The EU says no such formal proposals have been tabled. Why not, and when will he do so?
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman, I think, will agree that the Surrender Act had a material. The Hilary Benn Surrender Act, Mr. Speaker, did indeed have a profound psychological impact on our friends and partners over the Channel, and it has had an impact on the negotiations, and it has made things more difficult. And I think, in all honesty, I think he would concede that. But on the detail of the negotiations at present, Mr. Speaker, all I can say is that we have tabled proposals, as the right honourable gentleman who spoke from the DUP benches just now has confirmed. Progress is being made. It is not assisted by publishing our proposals today.
Antoinette Sandbach.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is very keen to point out how to deliver commitments made during an election. He wrote to the One Nation group during his election to be party leader that he was not much attracted to prorogation, something that he may reflect on now, and that he would seek to build consensus across the House. What undermines his negotiating position is that those watching from Europe cannot see how the Prime Minister is going to deliver a majority in this House for concessions that he will get. Can he update the House on the moves that he's taking to build consensus?
I thank the honourable lady, and actually I think she asked, Mr. Speaker, she asked an extremely important question, because I do think that in all intellectual honesty, the members opposite who voted for the Bercow Act, who wanted to take no deal off the table, who voted for the Surrender Act, should vote for the deal that we produce. Logically, and I'd like to hear from them that they will, Mr. Speaker. We will, I'm very confident, make progress towards getting a deal, and I hope it will command their support.
Yvette Cooper.
Earlier today, the Attorney-General did not just say that he would respect the Supreme Court's judgment, he also said, "We got it wrong." The Prime Minister has today just said the opposite and effectively said he thinks it's okay. for a Prime Minister to cancel Parliament for as long as he so chooses in order to not to answer questions. Many of us have had disagreements with his predecessors, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, David Cameron, John Major, Margaret Thatcher, but none of them would have done this. None of them would have been so chaotic, none of them would have shown such disregard for the rule of law or tried to concentrate power in their own hands by cancelling Parliament in this way. Why is he so entitled that he thinks it's one rule for one person and one rule for him and a different one from everyone else?
Mr. Speaker, I think the historical record will reflect that several Prime Ministers, and I think all Prime Ministers, have had prorogations, and John Major, for instance, prorogued for several weeks, I think, in advance of an election. But on her substantive question about the view of my right honourable lady colleague, the Attorney General, about the judgment yesterday. Let's be clear that we are as one in respecting the Supreme Court, and we are as one in thinking that judgment was wrong.
Mr. Graham Patterson.
We're told in the general election 2015, during the passage of the referendum bill in this House, during the referendum itself, that we, the MPs, would give them the decision. It would be a final decision, and whatever the result was, we, the MPs, would honour it. Right. The crisis we have is that for the first time ever, the people have not obediently and politely gone along with what the establishment wanted. We've seen the political establishment in this House, the commercial establishment, and now the judicial establishment go against the will of the people. They are angry. They feel thwarted by the establishment. Does the Prime Minister agree that the only answer is to leave on...
Order! The Right Honourable Gentleman... Order! Mr. Patterson, the Right Honourable Gentleman is well, he persisted, but the Right Honourable Gentleman was entitled to be fully heard. I hope he's content. But I was trying to help the Right Honourable Gentleman. I did my best to help the Right Honourable Gentleman. Go on, blurt out the last sentence, man.
Will the Prime Minister agree with me that the only way to resolve this crisis is to leave the European Union on the 31st of October by taking back control, leaving the customs union, leaving the single market and leaving the remit of the ECJ, as we promised in our election manifesto?
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful to you for making sure that last sentence was heard, because I agree with every word of it, and that is exactly what we are going to do.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier today, parents in Walthamstow contacted me extremely concerned about the content of a presentation about the Prime Minister's proposals and Brexit that had been broadcast on what it transpires to be 3,000 digital notice boards of primary schools around this country without the prior consent of the schools. Given the amount of money this government is spending on Brexit adverts, can he at least reassure Walthamstow residents that in this instance it wasn't his doing, and give his personal pledge that our primary schools will remain Brexit propaganda-free zones?
Obviously, I think the Honourable Lady is bringing me news about what schools in her constituency. What I can tell her, and what I think colleagues would like to hear, is that we're investing more in every primary school in this country by levelling up across the UK.
Penny Mordaunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the greatest acts of patriotism shown over the last few years was not by people like myself who voted leave, but by those who voted remain and accepted the democratic result. The general public never doubted that we in this place would act on their wishes. That is the trust that they had, and I think still have, in all of us here and this Parliament. Does my right honourable friend agree that when people trust you in this way, you do not let them down?
I think my right honourable friend speaks movingly and entirely correctly about our duty to the people of this country. They are watching these proceedings. They do want us to deliver Brexit on October the 31st, and I do urge colleagues around this House to think of their responsibilities.
Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, having now read the judgment of the learned judges yesterday, and this is the highest court in the land, and it was a unanimous verdict, and our congratulations go to all those who brought the action to defend this sovereign parliament. It is quite clear that on two matters, important matters, this government did not defend, did not supply evidence. And that's why the learned judges came to the conclusions that they did. The evidence of Sir John Major was that normally a government would prorogue for some 5 days. That evidence was not challenged by this Prime Minister and that government. And they offered no evidence as to why it was they sought a prorogation of 5 weeks, which led the learned judges, paragraph 56. I'm pleased to see the Prime Minister's making a note. I hope he'll go and read the judgment. I hope he won't be honing his pole dancing skills instead. But they wrote at paragraph 56, this was not a normal prorogation in the run-up to a Queen's speech. It prevented Parliament from carrying out its constitutional role for 5 out of 8 weeks. And at paragraph 61, they don't want to hear it.
Go for it, keep going.
But they will hear it, Mr. Speaker, because this is why the learned judges unanimously concluded there was no reason, let alone a good reason, to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. I came here today not just to represent my constituents, but hoping that this Prime Minister would show humility in the face of this condemnation in this judgment. Will he now apologise, if not to this place, to the country, and has he apologised to Her Majesty the Queen?
As she can imagine, I would not comment on my conversations with Her Majesty, but I think she's sadly in error, Mr. Speaker, in her history, because, to my memory, John Major prorogued Parliament for 18 days before he even had an election, and all we were going to lose was 4 or 5 sitting days over the party conference period, and she will have ample opportunity after the European Union Summit on October 17th and 18th to debate Brexit again, as is her privilege and her prerogative, and indeed her pleasure. And it was always intended, Mr. Speaker, that she should.
Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Whatever policy differences the Prime Minister may have with others, he may agree that he has an absolute duty to observe and uphold the rule of law. And whatever self-justifications he may have advanced today, he may also have to accept that in the matter of proroguing this House, he failed to do that. In those circumstances, would he now like to take the opportunity, rather than condemning the No. 2 withdrawal bill as a surrender bill, to assure the House that if the...
Order. Let it be said with crystal clarity, including to occupants of the Treasury bench.
Here we go.
Yes, here we go. The right honourable and learned gentleman will be heard. He won't be shouted down by people from his own benches. That sort of behaviour is intolerable, and it is obviously so to most remotely reasonable people. Mr. Dominic Grieve.
Will he therefore take this opportunity to give an assurance to the House that should the terms of the bill apply to him, rather than going to try and die in ditches, he will observe those terms as he is duty-bound to do?
Mr. Speaker, I repeat the confirmation I've made many times that this government observes and will observe the law. But our view, I may say to my right honourable and learned friend, that our view of the particular matter that was before the Supreme Court had the support of the Master of the Rolls and the Lord Chief Justice, who at the risk of embarrassing my right honourable and learned friend, are perhaps even more distinguished in the law than he is.
Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have been a member of this House for 27 years, and I never thought I would be present to watch the benches opposite erupt in applause when a Prime Minister who has had his political strategy torn to shreds by losing 11-0 in the Supreme Court of the land and being found, in the words of the judgment, it is impossible for us to conclude on the evidence which was put before us that there was any reason, let alone a good reason, to advise Her Majesty to prorogue Parliament for 5 weeks. It follows that that decision was unlawful. Why, Mr. Speaker, do we now find this Prime Minister leading a Conservative Party that feel that it's appropriate to applaud that?
Mr. Speaker, if I may say so, I think the commentary of the involuntary commentary of the benches in this House was more directed at the Leader of the Opposition perhaps than at anything I had to say. But my strong view is that the opinion of the Supreme Court has, of course, to be respected and fulfilled, and that is why I'm pleased to say we're all here today to listen to the right honourable lady.
Sir John Hay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1801, Horatio Nelson, perhaps our nation's greatest hero, chose not to see advice to retreat. In that spirit, will the Prime Minister turn a blind eye to the antics of the Liberal establishment and turn a deaf ear to the shrill bleats of those who seek to foil Brexit and frustrate the will of the people? For he must know that the loud and clear cry of the working people of this country is as straightforward as this: back Brexit and back Boris.
I thank my right honourable friend. I will not only try to imitate Horatio Nelson, I will lash myself to the mast, figuratively speaking, like Odysseus, and stop my ears to the siren cries of those opposite who would try to frustrate the will of the people and block Brexit. That's what they want to do. We're not going to let them do it, Mr. Speaker.
Liz Savile-Roberts.
And could I congratulate the resilience and resoluteness of intent of the opposition leaders in the face of the Prime Minister's incontinent goading. This government will abide by legislation to extend Article 50 unless this House decides otherwise. Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court decided that the Prime Minister did not prorogue this place in order to deliver a Queen's speech, but to stymie parliamentary debate. I would not presume to impugn the honour of the Prime Minister, but the Supreme Court clearly does not believe his motives to be, how can I put this, legitimate. Now, in 2004, the Prime Minister, who was then the Member of Parliament for Henry...
Sit down! Sit down. I'm going to try to be helpful to the honourable gentleman, who's a most dedicated and assiduous member of 2 years' standing. We don't have points of order in the middle of exchanges. I will try to provide a tutorial to the honourable gentleman on another occasion, but the honourable lady will not be prevented from asking her question. She's asking the question, she will ask it, and it will be heard, and the honourable gentleman will sit quietly and listen. Liz Savile-Roberts.
We'll find this relevant. Because in 2004, the Prime Minister, MP for Henley at the time, wrote a column in the Telegraph in which he argued that Tony Blair should be impeached as he, and I quote, treated Parliament and the public with contempt over the matter of disclosure of motives and legal advice relating to the Iraq War. The Right Honourable Member even edited a copy of The Spectator, which called for Blair to be impeached for lying. He also signed an impeachment motion.
Order. I have protected the Honourable Lady, and rightly so, from inappropriate attempts to cut her off. But she must ask a question, and I hope that she's... Order! I'm hoping very much that she's approaching the end of her question. She really does need to do so. Liz Saville-Roberts.
And to close that off, the Prime Minister at the time also signed a motion for impeachment of Tony Blair, which was brought forward by the now Leader of Plaid Cymru, Adam Price. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is surely not a man who would like to look inconsistent. So I ask him, does he still believe it to be right and proper to seek to impeach a Prime Minister who has been judged to mislead the public?
Already explained once. Let me say to the honourable gentleman again, in terms that brook of no misunderstanding, now is not the time for points of order. That time will come, and if the honourable gentleman's still interested, he'll be heard. But he really does need to learn the procedures in these matters. The Prime Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady very much for her question. I'm glad that she's such an assiduous reader of my column, Mr. Speaker, but I must correct her on two important points, or make clear two important things. The first is that the Supreme Court did not impugn the motives of the government at all. And the second, I think she should bear in mind, is that Wales voted leave.
And Maine.
Speaker, when it suits politicians, they promise elections and referenda. And indeed, in 2008, the Liberal Democrats promised a referendum on the future in and out. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that those who shouted the loudest for a referendum are now promising revoke, and that is undemocratic? Just as it is undemocratic to be bench-blocking and refusing the public the chance to decide to have a government that can be in power, not just in office.
Well, my honourable friend is entirely right, of course, and the absurdity of the Liberal Democrat position is only equalled, if not surpassed, by the absurdity of the Labour position, because they, after all, are committed to negotiating a new deal with the European Union and then campaigning against it.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the Prime Minister wants to appear as a strong man, but the strongest thing he could do that would look the best to this country at the moment would be to act with some humility and contrition. There are many of them, but the difference between the Prime Minister and myself is if the Labour Party had done this, I would be ashamed. I would be sorry that the Labour Party had been found to do this. And I ask the Prime Minister, simply, this looks horrendous to the public, and he thinks he speaks for the people. Let me tell you now, it will look much better if the Prime Minister rises to his feet now and says, I am sorry, I got this wrong. Let's try honesty.
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable lady, and I may say that I think, I do accept the judgment of the Supreme Court, as I've said many times, I think, this afternoon. But I also may say to her, in all candour, I think that the humblest and most responsible thing that we could all do as parliamentarians is show that we respect the judgment of the people and take this country out on October the 31st.
Steve Brine.
Much, Mr. Speaker. Back on the 3rd of September, I asked the Prime Minister, given his view then that the chances of a deal had increased and that things were moving, as he said to me at the time. What evidence of that progress he could put before the House? Now, I think the Prime Minister is unfairly maligned because I have sat face to face with him, as have many, and I know he wants a deal. So, in the light of encouraging noises from him and from his ministers in recent days, and as he said in his statement from the EU, could I just ask him again this evening, when he says we are making progress, what that progress looks like? Because I know he needs to bring together a majority in and across this House in order to get it through and to show that to our EU leaders, and I think that he is unfairly maligned, as I say. So, what can he put before the House to give us that encouragement?
I'm really grateful to my honourable friend, and as I said to the House in my opening statement, we've moved a long way off the idea that the withdrawal agreement was the law of the Medes and the Persians, fixed, immutable, graven in tablets of stone. That's absolutely gone. We've moved a long way from the idea that the backstop had to be retained in all circumstances. He will have heard Jean-Claude Juncker himself say that he no longer had any, I think he said, any erotic fixation with the backstop. In concrete terms, the three, and this will perhaps be helpful to the House, the three areas in which progress is being made are the concept of the alternative arrangements, which I know has been discussed many times in this House, and many right honourable members have gone over it many times, but it is a fruitful area of discussion. The second idea, which is also extremely fruitful, is the concept of doing everything we can to maintain the unity of the island of Ireland for sanitary and phytosanitary purposes. And as I'm sure my honourable friend who has studied these matters closely will acknowledge, that is a big concession by the UK government and a big advance, and it needs to be handled with care. We need to get the balance right, but we think that progress can be made in that area. And the third concept, and I mentioned it already in my opening remarks, Mr. Speaker, is the idea of consent. And I think consent holds the key, because the problem with the backstop, as honourable members opposite will recall, because I heard some very good speeches against it from the benches opposite, the problem with the backstop is it doesn't repose the locus of authority here in the UK, and we need to remedy that, and I'm sure he understands that point too.
Gloria De Piero.
Mr. Speaker, I campaigned to remain, the Prime Minister campaigned to leave. But I've always respected the result of the referendum. Now, to be honest, I don't want to work with him any more than he would want to work with me. But we both know that there are areas where both parties reached an agreement in those cross-party talks. So will he publish the areas of agreement from those cross-party talks, and will he use them as the basis for a new bill so we can stop no-deal Brexit and leave by the 31st of October with a deal?
Well, I can tell the honourable lady that I certainly admire the way that she's trying to work cross-party to bring this to a resolution, and I will take up her proposal and do what I can to bring it forward over the next few days. So I appreciate that time is obviously marching in very tight.
Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Significant numbers of MPs from across the House are coming together to indicate that they are MPs for a deal. Would the Prime Minister confirm, firstly, that he is one of us, secondly, that he is working hard for a deal, and thirdly, that we will have the opportunity to vote on another deal?
I can certainly, I thank my honourable friend for what she's doing, and also I think with my right honourable friend, the member for Cheltenham, who I think is involved in the cross-party work for members for a deal. I can absolutely guarantee that if and when we are able to bring back an agreement that I think will work for this House and for this country, on October the 17th and 18th, of course, we will put it to Parliament, and I do hope that it will then get assent.
Joanna Cherry.
In my naivety, Mr. Speaker, I thought we were coming to hear a statement on the Supreme Court judgment. But instead we've been treated to the sort of populist rant one expects to hear from the leader of a tin-pot dictatorship, or perhaps the current President of the States. Does the Prime Minister appreciate that his display is anathema
to the democratic constitutional tradition of Scotland, which was upheld in the UK Supreme Court yesterday. And I pray to God, Mr. Speaker, that he won't take his own country onto the rocks. But if he's intent on doing that, will he first of all recognise the democratic mandate of the Scottish Parliament? He spoke a moment ago about consent to be governed holding the key. Exactly. If he must take England on the rocks, and I hope he doesn't, will he recognise the democratic mandate of the Scottish Parliament and agree the means for a second independence referendum to be held in Scotland?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I may say, I do congratulate the honourable lady for bringing forward that action, because she did produce an astonishing result. Let's be in no doubt. It was a groundbreaking judgment. It was a novel judgment, and of course it's had the effect that we can all see before us today. Here we are back in this House of Commons. But I may say on her second point, the people of Scotland voted decisively in 2014 to remain in the United Kingdom, the most successful union of nations in history, and they were told that it was a once-in-a-generation vote. I think it absolutely wrong of her now to try to break that promise.
Dr. Julian Lewis.
When the Prime Minister eventually wins an overall majority at the next general election, will he make it a priority of his first majority government to repeal forthwith the ghastly fixed-term Parliaments Act?
Mr. Speaker, I think we're going to concentrate on winning that overall majority first, and I share his sentiments entirely.
Rachel Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This afternoon has been a horrendous spectacle. We've got a Prime Minister who has broken the law and uses dangerous language of betrayal and surrender, which sows division and worse in the communities that we all serve. And then we have his MPs who clap him for doing so. But what this afternoon has taught us is how important it is that Parliament is sitting through these crucial weeks, because it is only through Parliament sitting that we can hold this government to account. And that's why it's so important that Parliament is not dissolved for a general election or prorogued again, so we can continue to hold this government to account, because if the Prime Minister has broken the law once, why should we trust him not to do the same again?
Well, I must respectfully disagree with the honourable lady in her characterisation of the Surrender Act, because I do think it does. I'm afraid it has done damage. It has done damage, and was intended to damage this country's negotiating position. But I do think that it is also right. It is also right in this context to work hard together to get a deal done and to deliver on the mandate of the people, because I think that is what her constituents would want to see.
Thank you. Mr. Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my right honourable friend for his firm stance on this whole argument? And can I also ask him that when he comes back, possibly with a deal, it does not mirror in any way, shape or form the deal that has already been thrown out of this House. I, for one, and I believe the people of this country, do not want to remain in a vassal state, or with vassal state status, for years to come. Let's get this done and leave the EU.
My honourable friend is valiant for truth in this matter, and he is right. The problem with the previously existing withdrawal agreement is it does or would keep the UK locked in the EU in tantamount to vassalage, and we will make sure that the deal we do bears no resemblance whatever to that predicament, and we will have a deal that I believe he can fully support.
Next questioner, Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The irony is not lost on any of us that prorogation was nothing to do with Brexit, the Prime Minister told us, yet here we are talking constantly about Brexit. But it's a more serious. It's the more serious point about our political culture, Mr. Speaker, that I want to raise with the Prime Minister, because those of us who constantly remember our friend Jo Cox need our political culture to change now. It is getting toxic, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister's language is violent and his government is dysfunctional. So will he promise us that he will change? And can I ask him, just for this session, to take responsibility for his actions? Can he accept that he acted unlawfully? And bearing in mind that this issue is about advice to our monarch, will he tell us which of his ministers will resign?
I agree with the Honourable Lady that tempers have become very ragged across the country, and people feel the fever of Brexit, and I agree with her, has gone on for too long. But the best way to sort this out is to get Brexit done. And that is what we want. And I hope that she will join with us in getting a good deal for this country and getting it through this House of Commons.
Justine Greening.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister's talked about bringing a deal back to this House. He's also talked about his respect for the law and agreeing to make sure that he complies with the law. So can I ask him to be absolutely explicit that if he does bring a deal back to this House, and this House does what its right is, perhaps, and rejects it, that he will respect that, but he will also respect the so-called Ben bill that this House has passed, and then ask for an extension? And can I just say to him that continuing to call a bill that this House has passed a surrender bill is deeply disrespectful to this place, and he has said he must respect the Supreme Court ruling, and I would simply ask him to respect the decisions of this House too.
I must say to the Right Honourable Lady and my friend, the Right Honourable Lady, who I've worked with happily over many years, that actually I do think that the Surrender Act has done grave damage. What it would try to do, I speak as somebody who has to sit in.
Order. Can I appeal to colleagues in all parts of the House to calm down and let's have the exchanges. Everybody must speak in terms that he or she thinks fit, and I know we're all conscious of the premium that is placed by Erskine May on moderation and good humour in the use of parliamentary language. The Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I repeat that the experience of negotiating with our European friends and partners over the last few weeks has, I'm afraid, confirmed me in my view that the Surrender Act has made it more difficult for us to get a deal. And that is the sad truth, because what they hear is a parliament that is determined not just to stop a no-deal Brexit. That is not their intention. Their intention is to stop any kind of deal at all. That is what they want to do. And I can tell my right honourable friend that we will come out of the European Union on October the 31st, and we will not be extending.
Paula Sheriff.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I genuinely do not seek to stifle robust debate, but this evening the Prime Minister has continually used pejorative language to describe an Act of Parliament passed by this House. And I'm sure that you would agree, Mr. Speaker, that we should not resort to using offensive, dangerous or inflammatory language for legislation that we do not like. And we stand here, Mr. Speaker, under the shield of our departed friend, with many of us in this place subject to death threats and abuse every single day. And let me tell the Prime Minister that they often quote his words: Surrender Act, betrayal, traitor. And I, for one, am sick of it. We must moderate our language, and it has to come from the Prime Minister first. Absolutely. So I would be interested in hearing his opinion. He should be absolutely ashamed of himself.
think, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, I've never heard such humbug in all my life. Because the reality is, this is a bill.
Order. I appeal to the House as a whole to debate these issues calmly. I can see the gesticulation from colleagues, and I am not... Order. Mr. Linden, please, allow me to respond. I am not unmindful of the purport of that gesticulation. I have reminded colleagues across the House of the very long-established precepts of Erskine May in relation to the conduct of debate. I must simply say that nothing disorderly has been said. Everybody must make his own or her own judgment as to how to behave in this place, and all members will operate at the level that they think appropriate. If I see that there is disorderly behaviour, I will rule accordingly, and if I hear disorderly words, I will rule them out of order. I wanted to hear the honourable member for Dewsbury, and did so in full, as she absolutely had to be heard. I have listened to the reply. Let's try to respect order. No assistance is required. Let's try to respect each other. The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me just explain why I call it the Surrender Act. And that is because it would oblige us to stay in the EU for month after month at a cost of £1 billion per month. It would take away from this country the ability to decide how long that extension would be, and it would give that power to the EU. It would absolutely undermine our ability to continue to negotiate properly in Brussels. It takes away the fundamental ability of a country to walk away from the negotiations, and I'm afraid that is exactly what it does. And the best way, if I may say respectfully to members opposite who are getting very agitated about this, the best way to get rid of the Surrender Act is not to have voted for it in the first place, to repeal it and to vote for the deal that we are going to do. That is the way forward.
Vicky Ford.
Mr. Speaker, many of my constituents watch Parliament TV, and whilst we were away, they watched Catch Up, including an interesting episode where most eloquently the member from East Dunbartonshire said that she wanted a referendum. It should be an in-out referendum and people should decide. Does my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, agree with me that if the Liberals were Democrats, they should be working for ways to help deliver that referendum and heal the divisions, not create more?
My right honourable friend is entirely right, and the way forward for this House and for this country is to get Brexit done. And I think that actually there are people around this country who are watching these proceedings and who will agree very, very profoundly with what I'm saying. Get Brexit done, and let's take this country forward.
I do just want to emphasise in these proceedings, members must say what they think, and they do, and that's right, on both sides of the House and on different sides of this argument. But I would like to emphasise that I am keenly conscious of the fact that there are members on both sides of the House and indeed on both sides of the Brexit argument, who have been personally threatened and whose families have been threatened. And it is incredibly, no, but members on both sides of the House and on both sides of the argument have been threatened. And I have stated very publicly my revulsion at such behaviour, whether it has affected members on one side or the other, people who are anti-Brexit or members who are pro-Brexit, whose families have been wrongly threatened or whose parents have been abused in their presence. And I would simply appeal to responsible colleagues in all parts of the House to weigh their words. That's all I'm saying. I think that is a reasonable request of members in all parts of the House. It is in our wider interest as a Parliament, and it is in the public interest that we respect each other. That is a point which I think shouldn't be difficult to understand. Steve Double. I beg your pardon.
Following the events of yesterday, I've had many constituents contact me. Some are confused, bewildered, some are frustrated and angry. The vast majority of my constituents do not have the funding or the influence or the contacts to pursue matters in the Supreme Court. But what they do have is a vote. And in June 2016, they gave their vote. 64% of my constituency voted to leave, believing that their vote would count and the result would be honoured. Would the Prime Minister reassure my constituents that the events of yesterday will in no way detract from his determination to honour the referendum and ensure we leave the EU?
I can certainly give my honourable friend that absolute assurance, and we are working. On October the 31st.
McMorrin.
Mr. Speaker, I have never felt so embarrassed to be
by staying on in the EU month after month after October the 31st. Those tensions, that acrimony, all that storm on Twitter.
Greg Hands.
Speaker, I'm glad to hear of the Prime Minister's continuing commitment to getting a deal. And it seems to me that that deal will inevitably be based
The best way to get the people to have a say is to have a general election, and I hope she will support that.
Mr. Kevin Hollingreich.
Mr. Speaker, one of the precedents quoted
extra cost to pay for the education.
the Queen's speech, then we'd be able to have carryover for it. It's time we defended the women of this country.
I quite agree with the right. He's absolutely right, and it is one of the reasons that I want. I thought that was coming, Mr. Speaker. Well, I certainly am grateful for his support in my ambition to get Brexit done.
I have to tell the Prime Minister I was shocked that he, as the Prime Minister, should take it upon himself as being wrong. It was the Supreme Court, the highest court of the land. 11 judges who were unanimous, but the Prime Minister has declared this evening that their decision was wrong. He hasn't explained the grounds, but he's declared. I also believe that it is lawful for him to call another lengthy prorogation of this Parliament. And if he has that in his mind, when is he going to enlighten us as to when that prorogation is going to begin?
I'm grateful to the right honourable lady, but what I can tell her is that I do think we need a Queen's speech. I do think that we have a dynamic domestic
friend, I support a Brexit deal, and indeed I voted for it considerably more frequently than my right honourable friend. But if this great party stands for anything, it stands for respect for parliamentary sovereignty and the rule of law. And I would respectfully say my right honourable friend is tiptoeing onto a dangerous path. He's pitting Brexit against Remain, young against old, Scotland against England, and people against the Parliament. And would my right honourable friend
of the people and dither and delay, which is what the party opposite is standing for. And that seems to me a very clear dividing line, and I know which side I'm on.
Has he? So he must rejoice with me the fact that countries across Eastern Europe believe that their independence and sovereignty is enhanced by their membership of the European Union. He'll sign that extension.
Mr. Speaker, if he doesn't want to call it, what about the Humiliation Act? Will that
I do have a real question. The problem is this was billed as a statement on the Prime Minister's update, rather than just talking about
the record. She has no evidence for it whatever, because it is completely untrue. And I would like you to ask the Right Honourable Lady to withdraw it.
Well, I'm most grateful to the Prime Minister. The Honourable Lady has said what she said, but the Prime Minister... Oh, dear. Rightly so. The Prime Minister, I think, would readily acknowledge, oh dear, that in the light of all that, he doesn't require any additional protection from me. He has put the record straight, and it's there. It's on the record, and I thank the Right Honourable gentleman. Caroline Noakes.
Mr. Speaker, what matters in this place is not just language, but also tone.
Moment has arrived for the honourable gentleman member for Kingston upon Hull East, whose noisy activities I was remarking upon in a number of cities.
Aggressive language when honourable members on this side make very salient and serious points. Why does
when we bring it back to you, and I hope you'll support us in the lobbies.
Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's good to see my honourable friend back in his rightful place a little earlier than perhaps he had assumed it would be, and I hope he remains there a very long time. Can he give me some advice that I can share with my constituents when I try to explain why this Parliament refuses to approve a general election, refuses to vote to leave the EU, refuses to respect the wishes of 17.4 million people, and
poisonous puffball of Brexit is just to get on and make sure that the very word, and I know there's a lot of anxiety about language, let's make sure that the very word Brexit is never heard in 2020. Wouldn't that be a fantastic thing?
Caroline Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, I'm bitterly disappointed that Parliament didn't have the chance to agree to forego the nearly 4 weeks of the conference recess so we could spend more secure a deal with the EU 27 at the EU summit in October. Will he invite Parliament
Mr. Speaker, I backed Remain in the referendum, but my constituency and my country decided that he had from the minor parties in relation to a confidence vote or an election vote, as well as the Labour Party, to bring
where I have been and been very, very impressed with the level of preparations, and honourable members opposite who are anxious might educate themselves by going to see what has been done at Dover, and I congratulate my honourable friend.
Specifically from the comments of the Leader of the House that yesterday's judgment was a constitutional coup.
I'm not going to comment on anything that was said by any member of the Cabinet, but what I can say during Cabinet, because that would be totally wrong, because of course there is a risk of serious distortion in the reporting. What I can say is that the government has the utmost made negotiation any easier, and I'm just saying that to you in all candour and sincerity. And I think honourable. I thought that was coming, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend, my right honourable friend. He makes a very good point. And all I will say again, at the risk of further inflaming my friend's
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Taken over a seat that was left by our dear friend Joe Cox. Can I ask him, in all honesty, as a human being, please, will he, going forward, moderate his language so that we will all feel secure when we're going about our jobs?
Can I say the surest far away? Well, no, Mr. Speaker, I think the. Of course, there will be an attempt to try to obfuscate the effect of this Act, but it does, the Capitulation Act or the Surrender Act or whatever. ill feeling that is now rampant in our country. Get it done and we will solve the problem.
James Cartledge.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whatever one calls the European Union Withdrawal Act number 2, is it not a fact it does not take no deal permanently off the table? It would delay it till the end of January. And does he agree there are only 2 ways for those
I congratulate my honourable friend because that is exactly the right answer. I think the best way forward genuinely for our country is to come together. The best way to shut down democracy in this country and to erode trust in our political institutions is to fail.
I've known the honourable gentleman member for the Isle of Wight for a long time, and I'm not surprised but very pleased to see that, notwithstanding some
campaigner for the Isle of Wight as I've seen myself, and I thought he was going to ask me about the island deal that we're going to do, but I can assure him that we are. Don't worry. But
Solenn.
Guarantee that he won't try and pull this stunt again and seek
should be brought forward in this new context. And all I can say.
And his team well in the negotiations as they continue, because I'm convinced that there is a majority in like treason. However, I would finally just ask him if he remembers and made the man take his coat off, and maybe he should.
White hair, and he allowed two women, I think it was, to pluck out one hair after the other until he was totally bald. And
understood the role of Parliament, not simply as delegates to this place, but as representatives. There are two ways to go back to the people. The first way is a deal or no deal to the people in a confirmatory vote. Both of those ways will unlock the parliamentary deadlock. The only question is whether he has the
It would cost another £1 billion a month. I simply fail to understand his logic.
I just want to ask the honourable gentleman. At any stage. Without interruption. Very good.
Bencher, the Prime Minister visited my constituency, and just 4 or 5 days later, we won 2 more.
I remember well that happy afternoon we spent in J.D. Wetherspoons, as I see. I also noted their determination to get
Lillian Greenwood.
Mr. Speaker, the Supreme Court judgment yesterday began, and I quote, "It is important to emphasise that
election, and we need to get rid of the current government when it is safe to do so. But if we're going to have a general election, if we're going to have a new parliament and a new government, what on earth is the point of a Queen's speech? Why would you prorogue Parliament and have a Queen's speech just before going to the country, other than as a ploy to use the Queen to promote your own manifesto?
As I said many times to the House, I don't want an election. It's open to the member opposite to try to persuade his colleagues to vote for a Queen's speech and to vote for the very progressive measures that we will bring forward, including on domestic abuse and domestic violence. But if he won't do that, then the logical thing to do would be to go to the country for a general election. But as there are hesitations on the opposition front bench about doing that, which for reasons that obviously I understand.
Vera Hobhouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We had a long, heated discussion in this chamber, but I think we've all come to the conclusion the best way to move forward is to find some form of consensus. And it's difficult because this House is divided, the country is divided. Can I offer him a true compromise? I will vote for his deal, and that's difficult because I truly believe he should stay in the European Union, and so do the people in Bath who voted for me. I will vote for his deal if he will vote to put it back to the people, and I will guarantee him he will get a majority in his House for this compromise in the country, and after that Brexit will be done.
Yeah, that's it. I may say, Mr. Speaker, what that shows is that you can't trust the Lib Dems, because her party, she wants a second referendum, but her party leader, as I understand it, just doesn't even want just to revoke the whole thing.
Debbie Abrahams.
I'm overcome, Mr. Speaker, by an immense sense of sadness from today. This afternoon's debate has been absolutely appalling. Anybody watching this will wonder what on earth is going on. And the calibre of the leadership that's been offered, the language and the tone, are not what should be represented of the leadership of this country. It is absolutely shocking. So can I ask the Prime Minister why he thinks getting Brexit done will actually solve anything, given that it's an absolute illusion, unless you are absolutely intent that there's never going to be any relationship with our nearest neighbours. Why does he think the 31st of October will get everything done?
I thank the Honourable Lady, and I appreciate the sincerity with which she makes her points, but I must say it is my strong belief that if we fail to get Brexit done, the disappointment, the sense of rejection, the sense that the public has been cheated of what they were promised will be very, very grave indeed. And I'm afraid the only way to alleviate the current tensions in the country is to deliver on the mandate of the people in a positive, confident and optimistic spirit. That is what we need to bring to this, and I hope she agrees.
Richard Burden.
I say to the Prime Minister that something that really disturbs me about the way he's conducting himself tonight and the way some of his colleagues have conducted themselves in recent days has been the sense of privileged entitlement that they have been exuding throughout. Privileged entitlement that led him, during this statement, to describe as humbug when an honourable member talked about the threats that she was receiving. A sense of privilege entitlement that led the Leader of the House to describe when 11 justices in the Supreme Court of this land decided on the basis of evidence that the Prime Minister had broken the law, described that as a constitutional coup. Does the Prime Minister agree that it is a constitutional coup, yes or no?
I don't think there could be any clearer example of a sense of privileged entitlement for a parliamentarian to decide that he is in a position to substitute his own discretion for the will of the people when he clearly promised the people that that will would be respected and upheld.
Carol Monaghan.
Mr. Speaker, since coming to office, the Prime Minister has lost 6 out of 6 votes in Parliament. He's lost a by-election. He's sacked his own majority. He's lost the case in the Supreme Court, and he's advised Her Majesty the Queen to act unlawfully. So he's got some brass neck to stand there at the dispatch box without a shred of humility and without apologising. So I've just asked the Prime Minister, what would it take for him to apologise for his actions?
Mr. Speaker, I've tried to show every possible humility today, both to the House and to honourable members, and indeed to the Court and to its judgment. But the best way we can all collectively show humility as parliamentarians is to deliver on the will of the people. And that is what we're going to do. I would add that we could also show some humility by stopping to talk exclusively about ourselves, to stop talking exclusively about Brexit, and to get on with delivering on the priorities of the British people. And that is why we wanted to have a Queen's speech, because I think they want to hear what we're going to do to support their healthcare services, to bring down crime on their streets, and to improve their schools. And those are the priorities of this government.
Andrew Slaughter.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. The judgment of the Supreme Court found the Prime Minister had acted unlawfully and outside his powers in the advice he gave the monarch. He's just said again that he believes that the court was wrong. Could he confirm that he's read the judgment? And if he has, would he point us to the errors of law or fact that he says that the 11 justices made?
If the honourable gentleman would study my statement, he will see exactly what I meant. And my views are shared, by the way, by the Lord Chief Justice and the Master of the Rolls, who I think he would accept are quite eminent legal authorities.
More eminent than him.
Angus Brendan McNeill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. This Brexit debacle is certainly an agent for change, and following on the point from the honourable learned member from Edinburgh South West, the SNP Scottish Government has a mandate to hold an independence referendum, which I hope he respects. The First Minister of Scotland has said she intends, before Christmas, to ask for a Section 30 order to facilitate the referendum in the next year. Can the Prime Minister give Scotland an update? Will he agree to a Section 30 order when the Scottish Government asks for it, so the Scottish Government can hold the mandated referendum? Yes or no?
Well, if Scotland will promise it was a once-in-a-generation referendum, and we must respect that promise.
Vernon Coker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just make this comparison, because I think it's what the British public will see. They will see a Prime Minister who the highest court in the land has acted in a way which is unlawful, and the Prime Minister has refused to apologise. Across the country, Prime Minister, many people in courts, both civil and criminal, are found guilty of various offences. And the magistrates and the judges in many of those cases, the first thing they expect is for those people to apologise, to show some contrition for what they've done. And yet they've seen their Prime Minister this evening and through this session show no contrition, show no apology for what happened, and just simply said in a blustering, boisterous way that I'm just going to carry on. Can the Prime Minister not understand how that appears to people? And I say to him again, it appears again that there's one law for him and one law for everybody else.
Speaker, I think the real contrast is between this party, which is the Democratic Party, which wants to honour the will of the people, and that party, which is trying to obstruct Brexit and will not have a general election.
Chris Leslie.
It's not a party political matter, Mr. Speaker. It's not a party political matter. In fact, it undermines the Prime Minister's attempt to call out extremism or ideology when he himself sort of mines that seam of extremism and populism himself, with use of the language of surrender and betrayal in discussing an Act of Parliament signed by the Queen, passed by members of Parliament who were elected, by the way, in 2017 after the referendum, who in all sincerity are doing it because they care about their constituents, they care about their jobs and their livelihoods, they want the rule of law, they care about our parliamentary democracy, and they don't. Honourable members of all parties do not want to have their patriotism impugned in that way.
So, by your leave, I'm going to keep my answers pretty staccato from now on, because I've answered these points quite a lot. I think if people care about their constituents, quite proper, of course, that they should, in every possible way, they should honour the will of their constituents and respect our democratic proceedings.
Of course, I completely understand that the Prime Minister will offer his own answers, short or long, as he thinks fit. I just innocently make the observation en passant that repetition is not a novel phenomenon in the House of Commons, and never has been. And I mean, the hour is still quite early. I've been in the chair since 11:30, but I feel I'm just getting started, really. We've got a lot more energy left. I'm not remotely perturbed, and I'm sure the Prime Minister's not running out of energy. I'd be very worried if he were. I'm sure he isn't. And, oh, don't worry about me. I can more than hack it. We're a bit longer here than he and I were on the tennis court, but never mind. Jim Cunningham.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not going to trade insults with the Prime Minister tonight because this is far too serious. I would just advise him to read a book by Senator Fulbright called The Arrogance of Power. But more importantly, we have millions of jobs in the West Midlands that could be at stake if you cannot get a deal. Now, you might say to me, Prime Minister, you had a chance to vote for the previous deal. But having said that, one of the reasons why we couldn't vote for the previous deal, there was no guarantee that funding for research and development, for the universities, for companies like Jaguar Land Rover would continue. Now, I very seriously say to him, in all sincerity, you should go back and make every effort to secure a deal that we can all support.
I could completely agree with what the honourable gentleman has just said, and he's right that we must protect supply chains in the West Midlands, and we, of course, have taken done a huge amount of work to ensure that that is the case. But the best thing we can do is get a deal that gives business certainty and continuity, and then get behind it, and that's what I hope to do.
Hannah Bardell.
Much, Mr. Speaker. It seems blindingly obvious that it is time, given the mess this Prime Minister has made, that he resigns. He can get on the fast train to the history books as the biggest loser. But what I'm really interested to know is that when this Prime Minister looks back on his short but catastrophic time in leadership, what will he be most proud of? Will it be dismantling democracy? Will it be breaking the law? Will it be lying to the Queen? Or will it be being roundly beaten in court by a swathe of girly swats?
Mr. Speaker, when I look back on the 64 days that we've had so far in government, I think I will be proud of 20,000 police officers on the streets of this country. 20 new hospitals, yes, 20 new hospital upgrades, levelling up education funding around the whole country, and providing gigabit broadband even in Scotland, Mr. Speaker. And let's hope that the incompetent, dissolute, reckless, high-taxing government of Scotland actually implements that initiative and delivers it to the people, or makes way for Conservatives in Scotland who will do it themselves.
Janet Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I originally was going to ask a question about Operation Yellowhammer, but I cannot ignore my honourable friend from Shrewsbury and the experience she had in this chamber. She spoke about the threats that she was experiencing as a woman, but also about other members as well, other female members. And I know the Prime Minister will know about violence against women and girls, and he would also know that the way in which he spoke and the language that he used are words that will linger and words that will do more harm than good. And I ask him to withdraw what he said, and I ask him to reflect on this. Will he do this?
Well, so I think everybody has to reflect on their use of language. But on the other hand, we must get Brexit done. And I say in all we must make sure that we end this national Brexcosis and national anxiety by delivering on the will of the people. And no amount of yammering from the gentleman on the opposite front bench, no amount of yammering from him is going to put us off from doing that. And no amount of synthetic outrage or confected indignation is going to deter us either.
So you guys were... Members opposite are very quick to talk about the economic vulnerability of their constituents. The truth is this country is vulnerable economically because of the uncertainty created by Brexit and the lack of the resolution of the Brexit issue. There is a mountain of money waiting to come to this country, and I believe once Brexit is resolved, it will come and create better jobs, better paid jobs for all our constituents. With that in mind, if members opposite really do care about the economic welfare of their constituents, they should get behind the Prime Minister in getting a deal.
My right honourable friend speaks of what he knows because he has done so much to attract investment to this country, and there is a huge amount to come, if, as he rightly says, if this House can come together and get a deal over the line. And I hope very much that we can.
Hugh Gaffney.
Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, you can't tell us what your proposals are that you have tabled to the EU after several attempts tonight. Therefore, if your proposals fail, will you include an extension so as you can bring it on?
Mr. Speaker, with the greatest respect to the member opposite, I think I did set out in some detail the areas in which we are now making progress. But I must say, and I repeat the point I made earlier, we've had almost 3 hours now of conversation in this chamber about an issue that really affects our constituents. I don't think I have heard a single original or helpful idea from the party opposite, not a single suggestion about how they think this country could leave the European Union and deliver on the mandate of the people. Absolutely nothing. Zilch, nada.
Nick Dakin.
Well, that's not true, is it? Because we've heard, and he has welcomed the comments from my honourable friend from Eastwood, my honourable friend from Don Valley. So it would be really good if he could remain consistent to, what he said a little bit earlier in what he says later. That would be a really positive thing. But what I was going to say, Mr. Speaker, is I was going to agree with my honourable friend for Gedling that this Prime Minister believes that the normal rules do not apply to him. And that must be the reason why we've seen no humility this evening in relation to him being judged by the Supreme Court of this land to have given unlawful advice to Her Majesty the Queen. A bit of humility would be very nice.
I think actually that the government as a whole has shown maximum humility in the face of the judgment, and we respect the court. It is not possible for us, alas, to agree with it without great intellectual inconsistency, but we respect what they have had to say. On your point, the honourable gentleman's point about ideas, I think perhaps I should make a distinction. Some members have certainly been very positive about the possibilities of doing a deal, and I much welcome that. What I was trying to say, forgive me, was that I haven't heard, in the face of the difficulties that this country has in bringing us together, I haven't heard much by way of original thinking on some of the problems.
Gavin Newlands.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The tone of the Prime Minister this evening has been utterly shameful, and I can't help but feel that the architect of this approach, Dominic Cummings, is irresponsible and dangerous, and I think the Prime Minister should find some new advice as quickly as possible. But, Mr. Speaker, I don't think he was clear in his response to my honourable friend, the member for North East Fife. So I'll ask him again, will he deliver a request without caveat For an Article 50 extension on 19th of October, yes or no?
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, we're going to go for a deal, and we're going to come out on October the 31st.
Martin Whitfield.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. To apply the mantra of this government with universal credit to test and learn, if we look at the Supreme Court decision, the judgment, and now with 2020 hindsight, what would the Prime Minister do differently?
Mr. Speaker, I think it would be fair to say that this is the Supreme Court is a relatively novel institution, and this is a novel and groundbreaking judgment, even by the admission of the plaintiffs. We will study its implications with great care, and I think the House might like to reflect deeply on it, because I do think the judgment is of great constitutional interest and importance.
Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I oppose the Prime Minister's unlawful prorogation of Parliament because it shut down debate on Brexit but on other issues as well. In September, I asked the Prime Minister to personally step in and prevent the release of Vanessa George, the child abuser that abused babies and toddlers in Plymouth. While Parliament was illegally shut down, she was released early. There's been lots and lots of things that are not good about today's debate. Could the Prime Minister give one good thing and agree to meet the families of the victims of Vanessa George so we can prevent that ever happening again and keep people like Vanessa George behind bars?
The honourable gentleman, I'm aware of the campaigns that have been run not just by him but also by other members for Plymouth in respect of Vanessa George, and I will certainly undertake to meet the families.
Gibson.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has broken the law in closing down Parliament, according to the Supreme Court judgment. Indeed, the Scottish Supreme Court went further and concluded that the Prime Minister had not been honest about his reasons for prorogation. Now, the Conservative Party fancies itself as the party of law and order, so I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, does he believe that all those who break the law should be punished? And does he believe that he is special and that does not apply to him?
Yes. No, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we're all here today.
Rouhani.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister congratulated those who sought to challenge the decision to prorogue Parliament in the court, bizarrely given he did not cooperate with that court case, particularly the one in the Court of Session. And actually, further to the point made by my honourable friend from Hove, the point was he did not cooperate, surely, because if he did and signed that written, signed affidavit, he would actually be facing potential charges of perjury had he done so.
Absolutely right. Prime Minister.
I must respectfully disagree with the point that the honourable gentleman makes, and as far as I'm concerned, the government has treated the court with great respect, and we intend to respect the judgment.
Geraint Davis.
On the issue of ideas, if Parliament continues to resist his desperate pleas for an election in order to enable him to secure a deal, and if Parliament says they will agree that deal but only subject to a public vote, would he prefer that or to inflict a no deal on Britain with all the medicine shortages and problems that would entail? Which would he prefer, his deal with a vote or no deal?
Obviously, I would prefer a deal, and I hope I could count on his support if we were to get one. And as for my desperate pleas for an election, actually, I'm not desperate for an election at all. I rather thought it was the function of the opposition to be desperate for an election. But if he's desperate for an election, then perhaps he could communicate with his right honourable friend, the leader of the opposition.
Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In his speech to the United Nations yesterday, the Prime Minister used his in-depth research into the tech sector to talk about artificial intelligence and the possibility of a dystopian future. Yet last week, it's reported that his Chief of Staff, Dominic Cummings, instructed that all government data held for UK citizens should be brought together, an extremely dangerous suggestion. So could he tonight assure the House either that no such instruction was given or that will be withdrawn?
Classic Dom.
What I can say is that I think what every member of the House would like to see, and what our constituents would certainly like to see, is the maximum efficiency in government. But he tells me he mentioned something of which I was, I'm afraid, hitherto unaware, and I cannot tell him whether he is accurate in what he says. But what I certainly think we should be doing as a country, as I said in the UN last night at 4 o'clock in the morning, I made the point that this is the country that leads in the tech sector in all sorts of ways, and we intend, as part of our government programme, to turbocharge that, and that was one of the reasons why we needed a Queen's speech, and still do.
Conclude.
Mr. Speaker, I've been in this House for 35 years, and I spent 5 years in the European Parliament, 79 to 84, with the Prime Minister's father, who I have to say was a very valuable member of a committee I chaired, because he was a very keen environmentalist. And all I can say after listening to this debate tonight is your father talked a lot more sense than you did, Prime Minister.
I must humbly accept the criticism of the Right Honourable Lady, who I've come to admire over many years, particularly for what her many campaigns, whether it's over the Kurds or the environment, or many other issues where I think she's done a huge amount of good. And she's perfectly right that my father is a great environmentalist, and I do hope that this government will be allowed to fulfil some of his dreams, whether it's on animal welfare or on conservation or the many other issues that he cares about. And that is one of the reasons why I hope to have a Queen's speech in which we can deliver on some of those ideals.
Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, can the Prime Minister firstly stop stretching out his arms like the dirty centre half who keeps committing the foul when he's cautioned about his behaviour this evening and his rhetoric? Now, can I ask him, who in government is responsible? Who in government is responsible for Parliament being unlawfully prorogued? Who will be sacrificed to save his skin? And when it comes to accountability and shouts of cowardice, does that not apply to him most of all?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we are all accountable to the people who send us here, and if we want to verify whether we still have their confidence, then of course the best way to do that is to have a general election.
Clive Efford.
I didn't expect any humility from the Prime Minister today because he has got a track record. But given that he was found to be acting unlawfully in the advice he gave to the Queen and to this House, I'm stunned that the Conservative Party opposite applauded him like a returning hero. It's absolutely shocking, and the public will make their own minds up about that. But he has used... Yes, let's get to the general election, because what the Prime Minister has been doing consistently, and the reason he was found to be acting unlawfully, is because he's used every single device to try to take this country out with no deal. And you can use words like surrender bill and all the rest of it, but the fact is that taking this country out with no deal is the least patriotic thing you can do. I did not come here to do damage to my constituents and knowingly vote for it in no deal. So, Prime Minister, my question is, he has said, and he's waved his finger and he's pointed over here and he's saying, if I get a deal, will you vote for it? My question to him is, will the ERG vote for it?
I think that we will get a deal that I think will command the support of the whole House, and I hope it will command the support of the honourable member, and perhaps he might indicate by nodding whether he will vote for it.
Martin Doherty-Hughes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me be clear. I will not surrender the votes of my constituents who voted to remain, and I will be damned if I will surrender their vote for their country, Scotland, to be an independent sovereign nation. Now, given that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland has surrendered his duty to sign the Ben Bill, Will he now advise the House, will the Cabinet Secretary sign it on his behalf and take it to Brussels?
We will, thank you, Mr. Speaker, we will, of course, respect the law. We will leave on October the 31st, but I think everybody would agree that the best circumstances in which we could do that would be if all the Labour members, all the Scottish Nationals, and all my Conservative friends come together to do a deal. I think the will is there in this House. Let's get it done.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Brexit may be a power game for the Prime Minister, but it will have devastating impact on my constituents. And whether he tries to strong-arm this Parliament into a no-deal situation or a bad deal, the reality is that our country is so divided, and therefore it is his responsibility to bring the country together. And his demonstration tonight shows that he does not have those skills, whereas my right honourable friend is reaching out to try and find that way. And therefore, this is no laughing matter. Our country is in a very precarious state, and it's about time this government took this seriously.
Yeah, absolutely.
And therefore, I ask the Prime Minister that no matter which deal he comes back to, that he doesn't pay disregard to the country, and that he will put that deal back to the people to have a final say.
Mr. Speaker, she was going so well. I thought that she was going to say that she would vote for a compromise deal, but I hope that she will think of that, because that is, I think, what her constituents would want to see.
Matt Weston.
Mr. Speaker, 3 weeks ago, thousands of people up and down the country protested about the suspension of Parliament. 600 good people in Warwick and Leamington incensed by that decision. Now we know, as a result of yesterday's Supreme Court judgment, that we were deceived, the people were deceived, and even the Queen was deceived. One of my constituents has described the Prime Minister as the Wizard of Uxbridge. Such is his great illusion and deception. Can I invite the Prime Minister? He wishes for a general election. Come the day, may I invite him to Warwick and Leamington and help me in my campaign to get re-elected?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can't prophesy exactly what my itinerary will be in the course of the general election campaign, but I cannot exclude the possibility that I may indeed pay a visit to the constituency of the Honourable, where I think his opponent has every possibility of success.
Alison Thewlis.
Mr. Speaker, I made some use of the prorogation to go and chat doors in my constituency, and it's been quite interesting because I spoke to lots of people who voted no in 2014, and over the past 5 years they've seen the shambles of Brexit, they've seen this Prime Minister unlawfully shutting down Parliament. So can he tell me what this tawdry, pathetic, shambolic, chaotic farce of a Parliament has to offer my constituents?
Well, I may say I congratulate the Honourable Lady on the eloquence with which she's just made the point I tried to make earlier, and she might direct her wrath at the Leader of the Opposition, because I think it's time we had an election.
Matt Rodder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have to say I've been saddened by the tone of debate in this House tonight. Mr. Speaker, with power should come great responsibility, yet sadly that is not always the case. We've seen the Prime Minister treat this House and indeed the rule of law with a disturbing lack of respect. Does he have any shred of remorse for his behaviour?
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid the straight answer to that is no, because we are the point of view, although I must repeat the humility with which we approach the judgment of the court and indeed the court itself, but on the substance of the issue, we were only sharing an opinion that was held also by the Lord Chief Justice and the Master of the Rolls, and those are very high legal authorities.
Mrs. Sharon Hodgson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Whilst Parliament was unlawfully prorogued, British businesses such as Nissan in my constituency have been putting their products, in that case cars, on ships to export across the world without having any clarity about what the customs arrangement will be when they arrive at their destination up to 6 weeks later. So he's been Prime Minister for 64 days, as he proudly told us before, and his other colleagues have asked tonight numerous times, what has he been doing? Because is he able to give any clarity tonight upon what is going to be in that deal that he has been seeking with Europe in order that those businesses, such as Nissan, who've got cars on ships now, know what is going to happen to them when they arrive in the ports?
I thank her, and obviously I do congratulate Nissan on what they are doing to get ready, also on their stunning manufacturing performance. And we are working very hard to protect supply chains, not just for Nissan, but for all motor manufacturing companies. And the best thing for those companies, as the leader of the opposition shouts from a sedentary position, is to get a deal. And to get a deal is not to enfeeble the government's negotiating position by trying to take no deal off the table, which is what he has tried to do.
Ian Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Supreme Court judgment yesterday and the Prime Minister's performance in the House this evening shows that he's not only not fit to be Prime Minister, but he's embarrassing the entirety of that fine office. To respond to my honourable friend from Cardiff North, when she was appealing to him to tone his language that she's got another thing coming, is quite frankly disgraceful. And he may screw up his face, but Hansard will show that that is what he said. The problem that the Prime Minister has is nobody in this House trusts him. He's been asked 5 times this evening if he would abide by all the provisions of the European Union Withdrawal No. 2 Bill, and he refuses to answer the question. So for the 6th and final time, if he doesn't get a deal through this House, or a no deal through this House by the 19th of October, will he seek an extension from the European Union to the 31st of January?
No.
Mr. Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was a figurehead for the Leave campaign, a campaign that told lies about the £350 million a week, a campaign that broke the law on data protection, a campaign that broke the law on spending rules and funnelled dark money to the DUP. Earlier this year, the Standards Committee said he demonstrated an over-casual attitude towards obeying the rules of the House. And roughly the same time, the Press Standards Organisation ruled that he wrote an inaccurate article about a no-deal Brexit and was previously sacked as a newspaper columnist for making up facts. It's a case. He's been a serial breaker of the rules and a serial breaker of the law, as the Supreme Court showed yesterday. Isn't it the case he's never been fit to be in office, and it's high time he did the right thing and quit?
I thank the honourable gentleman. He gives me occasion to remind him that actually we are massively increasing investment in the NHS under this government, another £34 billion, and the policy to which he is committed, and indeed the Leader of the Opposition is committed, would keep this country in the EU at a cost of another £1 billion a month, when you could spend £250 million a week building a new hospital. Is that really what they think is in the interest of this country or of their constituents? It's absolutely absurd.
Order. In a moment, I thank the Prime Minister and the front bench spokespersons and the 111 honourable and right honourable members who questioned the Prime Minister over the last 3 and a bit hours. If the points of order, consistent with the earlier approach, arise specifically from and relate to these matters with which we have just been dealing, I'll take the point of order. I think it would be a courtesy to stay for the point. It would be a courtesy to stay for the point of order. The point of order relates to the matters with which we've just been dealing. I asked the Prime Minister if he'd be willing to stay, but he doesn't wish to do so. So be it. But the honourable gentleman's point of order will be heard. Point of order, Mr. John MacDonald.
Mr. Speaker, I regret the Prime Minister has left the chamber. The penultimate question to the Prime Minister was from my honourable friend of Edinburgh South, I believe, which was, in the fulfilment of all the conditions with regard to legislation that this House has passed, would he then abide by that legislation? Now, I might have heard wrong, but I believe the answer was a single word: no. That means that we have passed legislation. My honourable friend said if all the conditions of that legislation were fulfilled, would he then ensure that the action from an enacted piece of legislation would be taken? We are now moving into new territory where a Prime Minister already found guilty of an unlawful act is now refusing to abide by the law as passed by this House. We are moving into an extremely dangerous position with regard to accountability of a Prime Minister, this House and our democracy itself. I would ask you, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has left this House, even though it is quite clear you indicated to him that the point of order related to his behaviour. I would ask you, Mr. Speaker, to express the view that we expect the Prime Minister to be back in this House to ask that question again.
I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order. I didn't say to the Prime Minister that the point of order related to his conduct or behaviour. I didn't say that. I didn't know what the point of order was going to be. I said to the Prime Minister that the point of order related to the matters with which we had just been dealing. In other words, in keeping with the approach that I adopted in respect of points of order following earlier statements, points of order that came from members, honourable or right honourable members on both sides of the House, I was happy to take them after the statements to which they related. And I suggested that the Prime Minister might wish to stay. He indicated initially that he was minded to do so, but he then decided that he wished to leave the chamber. He has been here since 6:30. He was here for 3 hours and 11 minutes, and he